I'm sure that you've noticed that once we open the user dropdown, it stays open, like forever. What we'd expect to happen is for it to close when we click anywhere outside of the dropdown menu. In order to implement that, let's create a custom directive. While we could grab some off the shelf solution from NPM, I want to show you how you can wire this up yourself so that you'll be able to write your own custom directives in the future if needed. However, for most real world situations, I would definitely grab an existing package. First off, what is a view directive? A directive is any of those attributes we add to the elements in the template that start with a V. For example, vOn, v4, or vIf. But we're not limited to just using the built-in directives. We can create custom ones for specific use cases. So, we want to create a custom directive, v-click-outside, and on click outside, we want to set the user dropdown open data to false. And actually, there's a caveat to custom directives. We cannot use expressions like this in custom directives like we do in vOn to change the component's data, because the scope is not the same. Instead, we should pass functions. These could be methods defined on the component, or they could even be anonymous functions if we only want to execute a simple expression. That's what we'll do. Note that I'm adding this to the A tag surrounding the dropdown trigger, as well as the dropdown itself, because if I added it only to the dropdown, clicking on the trigger would cause the dropdown to close, effectively making it impossible to ever open the dropdown. Alright, let's make this directive actually work. In order to keep this directive definition isolated and organized, we'll register it using a plugin. If you remember from making the Font Awesome plugin, a View plugin is nothing more than a function that accepts the View application instance. And in order to register a directive, we call the directive method on app, which takes the name of the directive and the directive itself. We don't have to prefix the name with v dash. This is done automatically by View. Cool. Now let's define that directive. Just like a component goes through some lifecycle hooks, so do directives. And in View 3, they've been renamed to better match up with the component lifecycle hooks. So, the two that we are concerned with are mounted and unmounted. In mounted, we will set up our event listeners on the document to listen for a click outside of the element with the directive. And on unmounted, we will clean up the event listener, just as we would want to do in a component. First, let's fill out mounted. Mounted receives the element the directive is used on as the first argument. And secondly, the binding. The binding is an object with some helpful data like the component instance and the value provided to the directive. Now, let's set up an event listener on the document body. Inside the event listener, we'll check to see if the element clicked on was the same as the element with the directive on it, or if it's an element nested inside of the element with the directive on it. And if it's not, we can call the function passed as the value of the directive. Cool. Now let's extract that to a named function so that we can remove the event listener. And actually, let's define it as a method on the element itself. That way we can access it in the unmounted hook to remove it. I've used these underscores in the method name to prevent clashes with other properties and methods defined on the element, since there's more of a chance of clashing here with other plugins and such. Then, in unmounted, we can remove the event listener. Great, that should get us a working custom click outside directive. Let's go over to main.js and use our plugin, and we should be good to go. Back in the browser, we've got a dropdown that closes as expected. If you want to know more about custom Vue.js directives, you can read up on the official documentation provided in the links below. In this lesson, we will make our navbar work on mobile. When I set the device on DevTools to a phone, notice that we have this nice hamburger menu. However, when I click it, nothing happens. Here, we see that in order to open the navbar, we need to add the class navbar_open. So, when a user clicks on the hamburger, we should toggle this class, and it will be good to go. This is very similar to how the user dropdown works. I will add a data property to know when the navbar is open. Now, I will conditionally append the navbar_open class based on our flag. Sweet! Let's add the toggle functionality to the hamburger. Let's give it a shot in the browser. That's nice. Now, when the user is logged in, the mobile navbar will be empty. This is because the user dropdown is only designed for desktop. What we can do for that is to add a link for the profile page and one for signing out, and give them the class of navbar mobile item that will hide the links on the desktop. Please notice here that these class names are specified by our designer, so if you want to do the same in another application, make sure to create the corresponding classes. And of course, we only want to show them when the auth user exists. Okay, cool. We also want to close the mobile nav when users click outside of our header. To do that, we can use our click outside directive. Back in the browser, we have a nice and simple mobile navigation. And, actually looking at it now, I think it would be nice to close the navigation whenever the user changes routes, so that it won't linger after you've clicked a navigation item. We can do this with a route guard. And Since the sign out navigation item isn't actually changing routes, in order for this to work, we need to either manually set mobile nav open to false or make it just change navigation. I'll just make the sign out also redirect us to the home page so that the before each navigation guard will fire. We can do this by calling router.push after we dispatch sign out. You can actually call multiple expressions in a v-on by separating them with a comma. And I'll do the same thing for the sign out button for mobile. This should do it. Now, clicking outside of the nav will close it, and navigating to another page will also close it. Another situation where we might want to close the mobile nav bar is when users scroll the page. Let's create another custom directive to handle that. We'll call this one Page Scroll. Now, let's create the Page Scroll directive file in the Plugins directory. Here, we'll export the function to make the plugin, just like we did before. And we'll create the directive. This directive's job is to call the past expression when the user scrolls, right? So, on mounted, we will assign the binding value to a property on the element. Then, we will add a scroll event listener to the document and pass it the function. Lastly, we will clean up the event listener in unmounted. Before we check it out in the browser, we need to import it and then use it in main.js. Back in the browser, when we are on mobile and scroll down, the navbar closes. Awesome. While this works great, there's always one thing you need to be aware of when working with scroll events. They fire, like, a lot. To demonstrate that, let me add a console log to the page scroll. Scrolling here at a leisurely pace gives us 84 times the function fired. We don't really need it to fire that often. A common solution to this issue is called debouncing. Debouncing a function means to limit it to only a single call within a specified time frame. So, we can debounce our page scroll function to only happen, say, maybe once every 200 milliseconds, instead of the 84 or so times we saw just now. Since debouncing is a common need, there are plenty of libraries out there that handle it. I'm used to using the debouncing function from Lodash, so let's install that. I'll install it by typing npm install Lodash --save. For those of you not familiar with Lodash, it's a popular JavaScript utility library that provides a wealth of utility functions. You may be thinking, why in the world would you install so many utility functions when all you need is a single debounce function? Well, that's one of the great parts about creating our project with Webpack. If we only import the debounce function from Lodash, then the debounce function is the only thing from Lodash that gets bundled into our application's JavaScript file. And should we need any of Lodash's other functions in the future, we can just cherry pick the ones we want. Alright, let's import the debounce function. Now, to use it, we provide the function we want to debounce as the first argument, and the time frame in milliseconds as the second argument. Cool. Now let's see how often it fires. Nice, only one time. And when we scroll back up to the top, you can see that the nav is closed. I don't like, though, how the nav didn't disappear right away. We can fix that by passing the leading option to the debounce function. This says invoke the function first, then do the timeout, as opposed to the default of doing the timeout, then invoking the function. This time, it closes right away and still fires only twice. While this use case might not warrant debouncing, as our function doesn't do a whole lot, debouncing scroll events is a good habit to get into, as they have the real potential of causing performance issues.